Titus Livius. The great Roman historian Titus Livius was born in 59 BC at Patavium, which at the time was the most economically prosperous city of northern Italy. Now, the citizenry of Patavium were renowned for their stern morality. Though Romans considered the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul to be the intellectual and cultural backwaters of the empire, ultimately the region would come to produce some of Rome's most prized literary artists, including Virgil and Catullus. Patavium was incorporated into Italy and given universal Roman citizenship in 49 BC by Julius Caesar, and as such, the city wasn't yet subject to the luxury and corruption which infected Rome during the Punic Wars. Livy was likely from a well-to-do family, but very little can be said concerning his personal life with any assurance, since he hadn't served a public career to be documented by other writers, as was the case with Cato, Sallust, Tacitus, and Ammianus Marcellinus. Having never held any position in office or the military, Livy was entirely dedicated to the study of history and literature throughout his youth. Evidence from personal anecdotes interspersed throughout his texts suggests that he hadn't arrived in Rome until his early 30s, where he gave recitations of his work and won the friendship of Augustus, who valued Livy's moderately conservative and republican sympathies. Livy began composing and publishing his multi-volume Ab Urbe Condita Libri in or shortly before 29 BC. The works brought him instantaneous recognition throughout Rome. Having outlived Augustus by 3 years, Livy is said to have died in his 76th year in 17 AD at his hometown in Patavium. The body of criticism surrounding Livy's history of Rome is vast, with discussions habitually centered on the writer's qualities or shortcomings as a quote-unquote historian. His style and his relation to his sources appear to be the most debated topic, with opinions varying widely among ancient and modern critics alike. Recent evidence suggests that Livy's accounts are far more credible than once believed, however. Ever since Alfred Klotz's article on Livy appeared in the 1926 volume of the Pauli Wassoa, the view of Livy as a historian rather than a literary artist had risen sharply. The theory that Livy had been a mere copy-paste compiler of his sources was also shown as unsustainable in the mid-20th century by a handful of scholars in Livian historiography. Some scholars demonstrated how Livy first began by attentively reading his sources before proceeding to construct his own narrative, picking specific items from his authorities and thoroughly reshaping them in his own literary and rhetorical style. Others claim that Livy is our most commonly reliable source for establishing the earliest records of the magistrates of the Roman Republic, with some arguing that, quote, Livy is our most objective and factual source of knowledge concerning Roman colonization. Even the long-held confidence in the authority of Polybius, wherever he and Livy are in disagreement, is no longer accepted as safe. In any case, Livy's history has provided so much more than a source of information, since it also holds a vital interpretation of Roman history from a contemporary perspective. Even if historical truth couldn't be deduced from his narrative directly, we gain access to a critically fleshed out and unique point of view vis-à-vis more than 7 centuries of Roman history. At the heart of Livy's history lies the theme of Roman national character. While environmental and sociological conditions were important in shaping the virtues that made the Roman poet great, Livy seldom described the inner workings of institutions, cults, or social structures in the way that modern historians do with analytical excursions. To the traditional Roman historian, digressions like these would only serve to throw off the artistic character of the work and detract readers from its intended didactic purpose. In its entirety, Ab Urbe Condita Libri describes the legendary founding of the city in 753 BC and the period of kings, all the way down to the rule of Augustus in the 9th century BC. The text encompasses a daunting 142 volumes, of which only the last 22 deal with events contemporary to Livy's own life. Since only a quarter of Livy's massive undertaking survives to modern readers, we must never overlook the fact that the accident of preservation has undoubtedly distorted our views of Livy, and generalizations based on the extant texts are speculative at best. A famous epitome of Livy's text was written as early as the 1st century AD, from which were compiled the perioeci, or short abstracts, for each book. The perioeci, preserved in manuscript form, were perhaps composed as late as the 4th century AD. What puzzles us now is whether the authors of the perioeci were working directly from Livy's work, or from an even earlier summary, since this knowledge would be vital to filling in the gaps covered by the non-extant volumes. Comparisons of the perioeci with the extant books have generated a suspicion that the summaries can't always be trusted to provide a reliable account of the lost book's contents. A reference by the poet Martial exists which lends support to the view, first set out by Theodore Mommsen in 1861, that an abridged version of Livy's history provided the main source for those later historians whose requirements demanded an outline of Rome's distant past. Mommsen established that a large number of authors drew much of their material from a lost epitome which wasn't entirely congruent with Livy's original composition. Of the original work, there only survives books 1 to 10, 21 to 45, and a fragment of Book 91. Books 37 to 40 and 48 to 55 are covered by the surviving Epitome, which were discovered on an Egyptian papyrus in the 20th century, while the perioeci survive for all the books bar 136 and 137. In the tradition set down by Herodotus and Thucydides, Livy opens Ab Urbe Condita Libri with an introduction explaining the work's main purpose. This is to celebrate the deeds of the greatest empire in the world, to describe the virtuous men and the traditions which had raised Rome to greatness, and subsequently to describe the deterioration in public morality which was the catalyst for the troubles of the 1st century BC. Though Livy's preface denoted an original approach, it was ultimately part of a tradition which reflected the influence of Stoic philosophy on the model of late Hellenistic historiography. Since virtually all Roman historians made use of Stoic phraseology in their criticisms of human vice, it is difficult to discern whether Livy is overtly alluding to Stoic ideas or merely using the conventional discourse of moralization. His general purpose was both ethical and didactic, and his methods were inspired by those of the 4th century Greek rhetorician Isocrates. Livy believed it was the duty of the historian to report the impartial truth, but such a truth demanded a literary form lest it be no different from the dry chronologies and annals from which he had drawn his own information. Concerning the legends, which he relates in the early parts of his work, Livy borrows from the tradition of Herodotus, neither affirming nor denying their historical veracity, regarding such matters trivial and beyond the scope of verification. This isn't to say that Livy was entirely uncritical of his sources. If the accounts of Rome's legendary foundations weren't true, then they at least resembled the truth, and therefore still illustrated the features of Roman character which drove Rome toward imperial greatness. From the outset, it should be clear that Livy's goals are incompatible with those of the modern historians and can't be judged according to their criteria. His works were intended to moralize an audience, not pander to an unforeseen group of scholars in the distant future. Indeed, his aim was to record the rise of Rome over the whole of the Mediterranean world. Nonetheless, such a setting is used only as a context for relating the virtues responsible for bringing Rome to glory. To construct his narrative, Livy generally relied on previously written histories and made relatively little use of original primary records. The scientific method and the discerning eye of Thucydides and Polybius aren't shared by the rhetorically oriented Livy. His most frequently used sources were those of the early Roman annalists, Polybius, Posidonius of Rhodes, and the memoirs of Julius Caesar and Augustus for the later books. Apart from a few references to geography and landmarks which Livy could recall from his own memory, he relied on literary sources and didn't regard the use of primary source material as a priority. His inexperience in military matters made his descriptions of battles often unrealistic, undetailed, and expressed in short, vivid sentences. His poor understanding of the inner workings of the Roman political machine also leaves modern readers with substantially less light shed on the economic or social conditions of life in Rome. At times, Livy even sacrificed chronology for the sake of variety, and when historical contradictions between his sources arose, he often selected the best source through which Rome's national virtue could be championed. As a result, Livy has often been accused with confusing or misunderstanding his sources, resulting in a number of inconsistencies. Anachronisms and implausible events often arise throughout Livy's narrative as a result of his ignorance to the social conditions of far-removed times and places, such as those of early Rome or of the East. Nevertheless, it can't be stressed enough that such discrepancies bear little relevance to Livy in the face of his personal literary goals. Livy was an accomplished and trained rhetorician, fully conscious of style as a tool for persuasion. Seneca writes that in his earlier years, Livy had authored a semi-historical, semi-philosophical dialogue. In the same letter, he writes about Livy's deep interest in the art of oration, an interest not only manifested in Livy's writing style, particularly through the use of direct speeches, but it is also confirmed by the testimony of ancient authors who cite criticisms and precepts on rhetoric given by him. Livy was openly opposed to the Thucydidean style of Sallust's historical writing, which he felt was obscured and convoluted by verba antiqua et sordida, old and impenetrable, or, dirty words. Through this, we can see a deliberate echo of the Ciceronian struggle to promote a pure Latinity, stripped of its archaic vulgarities. Around the time of Livy's birth, it was Cicero who urged Roman historians to surpass Greek achievements by elaborating the discipline of history with an ethical function. He called history the magister vitae, the teacher of life, and challenged Roman writers to move beyond mere utility and entertainment. Livy's goal-oriented use of facts and arrangement of material were thus part of a new literary tradition, consciously designed to control a reader's way of interpreting events. Significant events were treated dramatically and memorably, and the action was to unfold in a setting interpreted by Livy's creative imagination. His prose was eloquent, rich, and orderly, with many stylistic allusions to the works of Cicero. It was Livy himself, then, who came to satisfy Cicero's belief that history should be composed by an orator who could craft historical narratives which were, as H.V. Canter once put it, regular and continuous, flowing with a kind of even smoothness, without the harshness of judicial pleadings and the sting of forensic utterance. One detractor of Livy's style was the historian, orator, and poet Gaius Asinius Pollio, who saw in Livy an element which he scoffingly entitled patawinity, or the use of local colloquialisms. Regardless, Livy received widespread fame during his lifetime and thorough praise by his immediate successors: Tacitus, the Senecas, Quintilian, Lucan, and Plutarch. In addition to these famous writers, Livy was also the major source for Florus, Eutropius, and Obsequens, adherents to the so-called Livian tradition. He was then heard of very little in the Middle Ages due to the sheer size of his work, only to re-emerge during the Renaissance with enthusiasm. The historian who errs not was even an epithet given to the pagan Livy by the famously critical Dante Alighieri. Perhaps from the time when pontifical records were made available, and most certainly after the publication of the Annales Maximi in 123 BC, the history of the Roman Republic rested on an authoritative collection of documents set to a chronological frame which would ultimately impose its tradition upon Roman and later medieval historiography. With the Gracchan and Sullan annalists, the dry and unimaginative genre was elaborated and given literary style for the sake of historical intelligibility. Livy was the first to introduce a fully developed periodic structure into Latin historiography, reacting against the loose series of events and digressions characterized by historians as early as Herodotus. Livy accepted the annalists' convention wholesale, and even Tacitus, writing nearly a century later, wouldn't try to work away from it. In order to be intelligible and effectively didactic, history had to be interesting. Particular attention is given by Livy to major dramatic episodes, which were particularly numerous in Rome's mythic past. The rape of Lucretia, the assault of Virginia, the exploits of Coriolanus and Spurius Maelius, the expulsion of the Tarquins, etc. The fusion of direct and indirect speech is one of the distinguishing features of Livy's work, while the cold-cut style typically used to relate lists of politicians, elections, and armies is a deliberate imitation of the earlier writers or of the Annales Maximi. Firmly rooted in the framework of the annalistic form, Livy's history takes on a specific tone and style, and historians working in the annalistic tradition have proven vital in interpreting the character of Livy's text. With the help of an annalistic framework, Livy could compose the major dramatic episodes of his history according to the rules of rhetoric. Livy was quite the partisan writer, though his narrative doesn't refer to Roman soldiers as nostri, or ours, or exercitus noster, our army, and often he chose to write battles from the point of view of Rome's enemies, referring to the Romans as hostes. As a whole, Livy's work was designed to be morally enlightening, but such a moral purpose is not all-pervasive. In his mind, centuries' worth of moral decline had occurred, and it is likely that he may have lacked the confidence that Augustan reform had the power to overturn it. It is certain Livy agreed with Augustus's ideals, but he was in no way an official spokesman for his regime. It would appear that Livy regarded the rule of Augustus as necessary, but only as a short-term countermeasure to ending Rome's most recent calamities. Livy was so open in his praises of Pompey that Augustus called him a Pompeian, which did surprisingly little to harm their friendship, and even Tacitus, in Annales, Book 4, line 34, claims that Livy was open in his praises of Brutus and Cassius. At a first glance, Livy's writings reveal him to be a deeply religious thinker, but like Plutarch, he wasn't unaware that religion could easily degenerate into superstition. Setting themselves apart from the writings of Sallust, Tacitus, and the commentaries of Julius Caesar, the Ab Urbe Condita Libri are filled with references to the gods and their mandated religious practices. From a large pool of different accounts, we've attempted to extrapolate Livy's personal religious convictions in a wide variety of ways. Considering the vast array of scholarly opinions, it is likely that such a topic will never be unanimously resolved. One scholar maintained that Livy was religiously orthodox and thus convinced by the divinity of Augustus, which would help to save Rome. Another argued that, despite frequent references to religious matters, Livy perceived history as being predominantly determined by human beings, not by gods and fate. Another scholar argued that Livy was purely agnostic, but grasped the importance of religion as a vital historical actor. And yet another scholar saw Livy as a Stoic who respected traditional beliefs and practices insofar as they had been given symbolic place in a comprehensive philosophical system. The most reasonable explanation, from my perspective at least, was purported by W. Liebeschuetz in his 1967 article, The Religious Position of Livy's History, in which he argues that in the ancient world, quote-unquote, rationalism and an honest advocacy of religion don't preclude one another. He aptly claimed that Livy would have been unaware, or at least unconcerned at the inconsistencies between Roman religion and the more rational systems such as those of the Stoics. He suggested that Livy's attitudes toward the overwhelmingly public character of Roman religion was positive, insofar as it was used as an earnest tool for public morality. As a general rule, the rhetorically trained historians of Rome were unanimous in their opinion concerning the function of history. Disregarding the strictly empirical approach of Thucydides, the Roman historians considered it as their duty to enshrine virtue in order to deter men from their vice and save the state from generations to come. The dangers of such a moral interpretation of history manifest themselves in a biased account, especially as Livy is concerned. In Livy, ethical and patriotic considerations are inextricably linked for didactic purposes, with the aim of demonstrating to future generations that national greatness can't be realized without the possession of a vigorous morality and wisdom in the execution of foreign and domestic policy. Subjective or not, Livy's history has provided so much more than a source of historical information. It demonstrates a unique interpretation of Roman history by a perspective contemporary to, and in some ways involved with, the tumultuous Roman Revolution. Thank you.